Okay, so thanks everyone for coming along to our third session of the Ins and Outs webinar series, where we will be speaking about post-fieldwork. We have 4 presenters today, 3 from Sussex and 1 from Kent, I believe. And they will be sharing with us their experiences of transitioning out of fieldwork and beginning to make sense of the data in the next phase of the PhD journey. Just a couple of housekeeping rules as well before we begin. Each session will last between 10 to 15 minutes, where there'll be a 5 to 10 minutes window after that for everyone to share reflections, some comments, or ask questions to individual presenters. You can do that by raising the raise hand function in Zoom, and we can bring you in. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to any time to ask questions to any of the presenters throughout using the chat function as well. Please be supportive in your comments and reflections to each presenters, which I am very sure that you will. And so, yeah, I guess without further ado, shall we bring in Belen?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah. Can everyone see the screen? The PowerPoint, yeah? Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, hi everyone. I was a bit unsure about actually talking in this session when Luke reads to me, because actually I was going to attend the session because I just came back from fieldwork. Literally, it's been like 3 months, and I'm struggling a bit. So I was actually very interested in attending the session. I was a bit, I'm not sure how many tips or suggestions I can probably offer, but I can share my experience and talk about, the things that now I can see work well, the things that I regret or I would like to change if I could go back, and the point where I am now. So first, a little bit about my project. My project wants to explore the experiences of women working in a male-dominated occupation, such as the transport sector in Malaga. So when I was doing fieldwork in Malaga, as I say, I just returned 3 months ago. I've been talking to both women who work as taxi drivers and women who work as Uber drivers. So I thought it was important because it had some effects, and you will see some impact, and you will see later during my talk that my research, my PhD project was massively disrupted by COVID. So it's a long story, but to make it short, I had a different project when I started. My fieldwork was placed in India. I was in India when COVID arrived to our lives, and I had to return. I changed my project and I started again with a different project in Malaga. So a year more or less passed between these 2 things. So now I feel that I have missed 1 year, that I'm 1 year behind. And that makes me feel very anxious and gives me this sense of urgency. And you will see this has an impact in some of the decisions that I made during fieldwork and after fieldwork. And my methodology when I was in Malaga, it was basically, well, trying to find these participants, which was not easy. And it also, the fact that it wasn't easy and it was only through connections that I could find them, that also gave me a sense of a very uneven fieldwork. So some weeks I didn't have any new participants to contact. I had not many interviews, and then suddenly I would have lots of them. And this experience of having to work in waves made quite difficult, I think, to make the decision when to leave fieldwork, which I think is one of the most difficult things when you are in fieldwork, to decide when it's time to finish and to leave. Oh. Okay, so now that I'm back, and I have started trying to work analyzing my data and trying to write, I am already seeing some things that I'm glad I did, and some things I would change if I could go back. And I thought that I would share that with you. So one of the good decisions I think that I made during my fieldwork was writing monthly reports that I would share with my supervisors. So in those reports, I would summarize what had happened in that month, what participants I have met, what kind of interviews I had, and the themes that were emerging. And then I would share this with my supervisors. We would comment on that, and then that would continue every month. Another decision that I made was to change from a physical journal, a notebook, to an app that I was using. So in my case, I was using Day One, which is an app I was using both in my phone and in my laptop. And to me, that was very useful because I could add not only text and reflections and comments, but also photographs, videos, audios. I have the dates, I have the locations. So I'm finding now that I go back to this app sometimes because I want to find some information, or I want to know when something happened, the date. So it's something that I'm using, and I'm glad I decided to move into this. Something that I'm not so happy about is that I transcribed less than 50% of the interviews during fieldwork. So I knew, so my research is, or my fieldwork is basically based on interviews. So I have lots of audios, lots of minutes that I had to transcribe, and I knew that, and I knew I didn't want to wait until last minute, or after being back in Brighton, where I am now, to start transcribing. And I knew that, and I tried to transcribe during fieldwork. Still, I managed only about 50%. Once I'm back here, I would like not to have to spend this time transcribing and be able to have all the data and to start analyzing. So that's something that I wish I would have made that effort when I was doing fieldwork. And then finally, something that I really wanted to talk about today, because I feel sometimes we don't talk enough about this, is all the logistics that are involved, particularly when you do overseas fieldwork. So we usually focus on research, which obviously is important, but I feel, at least in my case, all these, logistics, leaving one place, having to, set up arrange dates, arrange what to do with your own things, when to move, where do you go, do you have a place to live there? All these things have been very important and can make a change. In my case, I rented a small studio in Malaga. It's a studio that is usually rented through Airbnb, so it's very focused on tourists. I was lucky because last year there were no tourists in Malaga because of COVID, and I could have a good deal. As summer approached, the landlady started asking me, what are your plans? When are you leaving? Obviously, she started having requests for the flat. So that meant that quite early, I think around March, I made the decision that I was going to finish my fieldwork by the end of June. This is also connected to what I was mentioning before about this sense of urgency that I have. Like, I lost 1 year, I can't wait, if I can save time, that's how I feel. So I thought, I don't need to wait 12 months, June will be fine. Obviously, June arrived, and because my fieldwork was also in waves, I was in one of the waves. So suddenly I had new contacts, new participants, and also something I had been waiting during the whole winter to happen, which was being able to be in the taxi with the taxi drivers, spending 1 day with them to see how the work was. That wasn't possible during winter because of COVID restrictions. And then 1 week before I was about to leave Malaga, this restriction was lifted. But I had already said I was going to leave my place and I had everything organized. So it was very stressful. My last weeks in Malaga were really stressful. I managed to stay with a friend for a few weeks and I could do this, spending this time with the taxi drivers. But, you know, all this just made me, I left Malaga with a bitter sense of, should I stay longer? Is that enough? So yeah, it's something, I'm not sure if it was, you know, the best decision, but I think when you are away, you have to make this kind of decision. So yeah, so about, so when I returned to Brighton, that was in August. So as I said, it's still quite recent. It took me a month to settling. So again, I didn't have a place to stay. I had to stay with friends. I found a flat. I moved in. I had to buy furniture, all these things you have to do. I don't think I was expecting it to be that long and that difficult, to be honest. So again, that's something, I'm not sure if we think about those things enough sometimes. I found the transition between fieldwork to being back in Brighton and the writing up and analysis quite difficult because these are two very different activities. So some of the things that I found that were very helpful for me were being able to be back on campus again. Having face-to-face meetings was helpful. I met my supervisors in person after 2 years. That was nice. And I had an office. I have a photo here of my new office. And that helps me to have a routine, to have a space where I can work. So this has been helpful. And regarding the research and the data, what I felt and probably what I still feel about, you know, like post-fieldwork is what I call noise and data. So I have all these conversations that I had during my fieldwork, the themes I had, you know, all these words, they are all in my head. And I don't know how to organize them. I don't know what to do with them. So that's one of the things I'm struggling with. And just to finish a bit of where I am at the moment, as I said, I found it very difficult, this transition. And I felt very lost and terrified and paralyzed. So my supervisors told me when I came back, just write something, send us something. And I tried and I felt so terrified I couldn't write anything. And that obviously made me very anxious. And together with what I mentioned before, this sense of urgency that I have because I've lost some time, that doesn't help. So obviously I am in that like cycle of, you know, anxious, I need to write, I can't write, and so on. So I was talking to different people, trying to get feedback from, you know, what they did to start writing and to analyze the data. And some of the things that helped me were reviewing these monthly reports that I mentioned before. That has been very useful. I had this folder with every, you know, the report for every month, and that has been extremely helpful. So I went through them. I could suddenly remember things that happened at the beginning of the fieldwork, which I forgot, and I have the themes, and that was good. So I put some photos here. I started going through this, trying to identify big themes, using different Post-it colors for different, I have two groups. I have the taxi drivers and the Uber drivers. So I was using two colors and just trying to put together like quotes and themes and things that look like they could go together, but also, you know, similarities and differences, and trying to build a picture with all that. So that's the photos that I have there. Also, because I wasn't ready to start writing about themes, which was the suggestion that I received from my supervisors, but I don't think I wasn't ready for that. So what I started was writing about my participants and the context. And that was much easier for me because it was more like telling a story. So I was telling the story of who these women are and why they started working in this sector and a little bit about their lives. And that was easier because it felt more like, yeah, just easier to write like a story. And the context also was relatively easier. So I managed to write about 8,000 words, which in a long time, I think it was like a month and a half. But I did it, and I was happy that I could do that. And now I feel a little bit more ready to start writing about other things and more like themes and connecting with literature. So I think it was, in my case, it was a good way to start writing. And then finally, something that I've learned for me, I can't think in terms of chapters. I just feel overwhelmed. If I think chapters, I'm writing for my thesis, it just gets too big. So I'm trying to break it down into themes. I think in terms of I'm writing about this theme, it doesn't need to be a chapter. It's nothing related to chapter, is this theme. And then we'll see where this goes. And that, at least for me, is helping a bit with the anxiety. And that's what I had for this talk. As you can see, I'm a very, still early days. And yeah, still trying to get there. Not there yet, but well, trying to find my way.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Belen. It was really candid, and I'm sure, like me, everyone else found that really useful and helpful. So yes, I guess now we have around 5 to 10 minutes for any questions or reflections for Belen.
Helen, can I ask how long was your field research?
So it was between 9-10 months.
How many months?
9 and 10 months.
9. Okay.
Around 9 months. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's intensive.
Yeah. Well, I think usually in our most of the people, they do fieldwork for about 12 months. So I felt I was cutting that, and that made me, I think that brought some insecurity as well. And as I said, I think it's difficult to decide when you are ready to leave. Like, I'm not sure if you ever feel like that. That's my.
I'm to your office. They're just putting rubbish. They are moving. Someone's moving. Well, someone moving in or out?
Okay. Okay. So yeah, Faye has asked a question in the chat there, Belen, who's asking if you could explain a little bit more about the digital journaling app that you mentioned.
I was actually going to include some like screenshots, but then I realized they all had some confidential information, so I couldn't. But this is an app. I'm sure there are others, but this is an app that can be used as a diary if you want. So it's an app that allows you to very quickly insert captions for every day. And it can be it's not mandatory, it can be every day or it can be different days, but I think it's created for that. So you can just very quickly just add a caption and so I use that a lot, sometimes just as reflections that came to me during fieldwork, sometimes to summarize something that happened that day, like I interviewed this person and this happened, just to capture that. But I think because I'm quite visual and I really like images, I use it a lot with photos. So photos that if I went around and I took photos of the taxi drivers or the cars that I found, I could very quickly include that in the app. And for me, because I had it in my phone, it was very quickly, and it's just, for me, it's just nice now. I know there is one place where I have everything. So I have reflections, I have just summaries of things that happened, I have photos, I have some audios, for example, that I exchanged with some of my participants. So, so yeah, it was just quite useful for me, more than the notebook. Good.
Yeah, thanks, Belen. Is there any other questions for Belen? I will abuse my position as chair then, I guess. I suppose it's half a question, half a reflection, because what I really sensed from what you were speaking about there is just a lot of anxiety, basically. And I think it's, you know, I think it's fair to mention that your fieldwork has been so heavily disrupted and is quite a unique experience, having to not only shift focus, but you had to move away from India all the way over to Spain. And so it's these kind of disruptions that I think are really important, especially when thinking about methodology as well, and what it is specifically that your 9 to 10 month ethnography has contributed. I think it's also fair to say as well, because you mentioned about how most ethnographic field research is around 12 months, but I think that's also a disciplinary disciplinary perspective, because you're from development, so you don't have that same pressure as, say, anthropologists do for, you know, not having that long. But I also just wanted to mention something as well called Patchwork Ethnography. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
No.
I've dropped a link in the chat there if you wanted to have a look at it afterwards. But I'm already having these big anxieties about what is it that my research is going to be able to contribute, because my research has been so heavily disrupted by COVID. Not only have I had like over a 1 year delay from being able to come here, but even now that I'm, you know, 3 months or so actually in the field, I'm facing all of these obstacles, and COVID is re-emerging as a domestic problem, combined with, you know, the needs of my participants who are clinically quite vulnerable. It is already making me feel quite anxious about what is it that I'm going to come out with, because technically, yes, I've had such a long time, and I still have, you know, around like 13, 14 months left of fieldwork to get. But this patchwork ethnography that I just mentioned actually makes a point that actually these things aren't necessarily all bad. Actually, there are moments where the obstacles are really good for rethinking aspects of your research. So I know for me personally, like reading this and getting on board with this idea of doing ethnography in stages that's, you know, really heavily disrupted, and having to try and work against the curves actually helped to relieve some of that anxiety. So.
Yeah, I think in my case personally, because changing the project was so dramatic and it was such a difficult experience, and moving from India, as I said, to Spain was so hard, that in a way it helped me, because for me just being in Malaga was a success. Just being there felt like, okay, that's something. So yeah, of course I went through all kind of emotions, and also I did the fieldwork through COVID. So it's not like I arrived and then everything was solved. Like it was constantly new things and having to be flexible and having to change this and that. But I think, yeah, I think this feeling of at least I'm doing fieldwork really helped me. And it brought this positive, you know, whatever happens, I'm here, at least I'm collecting data. You know, some weeks were better than others and all kind of things, and yeah, a lot of anxiety. But I think I made an effort to remember that. And to me, that really, really helped. So
Right, yeah.
maybe something you can like just, you know, halt into. And because I think in my case was very extreme, because I was already starting fieldwork in another country, but so then I can see it more vividly. But you know, for you having to wait 1 year to get into your place for fieldwork can be similar. So just the fact that you are there maybe, you need to grab it and say, well, whatever happens, at least I'm here. I can collect certain. Maybe it's not what I was expecting. Maybe it's not in that way. But yeah, these are the times we are living at the moment. We need to be super flexible.
Yeah, great. I did have another question spring to mind actually about interviews and your transcription and stuff, but I will put a pin in that for now, and perhaps we can come towards that at the end. That's okay.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks again, Verlaine, for that
Thank
presentation.
you.
And yeah, we'd like to bring in Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. I wish it was organized like Verlaine. Yeah, with all the notes and journals, really fascinating. I like that. Now I'm kind of realizing, that I should have done that, because you don't kind of remember when things were said and the date, stuff like that. Anyway, yeah, I'm Alex. I'm at the University of Kent and conducting my PhD, and now third year in the international conflict analysis. My topic of study is really looking at the role of religious leaders in conflict resolution in Eastern Congo. Really looking at the practice, rationale, and public political statement. That's what specifically really I'm looking in terms of how do they respond to violence. My methodology is similar to Verlaine. I'm doing ethnography, but sorry, let me close the door. That's quite noisy here. Thank you. Yeah, conducted the interviews while I was there, about 36 interviews with religious leaders. I focus on elites, really because of the nature of their influence in society, and also to actors in conflict. I also done some archiving, looking at public and political statements that's especially Catholic Church makes at different times of big events of conflict. I've done observations, probably about 6 observations, and online focus groups, that's how I'm calling it. Basically, I managed to get some contacts of about someone who enabled me to join a WhatsApp group of 150 leaders across the country. Then I kind of engage with them. Some of them will respond via inbox. That's was also another really interesting, because they don't wanna kind of show necessarily how their view publicly. That was really interesting. Most were kind of responding to me in inbox. I also used kind of case studies, really picking up on Catholic Church social actions, some of their work in Eastern Congo, but also the Protestant church, again, a similar type of social action, looking at what they do in terms of a conflict, in responding to conflict. My experience, I'm going through really kind of headings that Luke has kindly given me. It was also like Verlaine, it was during the pandemic. Really the biggest, the difficulty I had was kind of to get my risk assessment approved, especially, going into a conflict zone. That was more harder than actually ethical approval in relation to COVID. So really I went through so much back and forth insurance, as Belen was talking about, some of logistics that go on in operation. They're quite a lot, really. Say, getting permission to conduct research in Congo, I don't think this is a tip for apply to everyone, but some African countries, you really need to make sure you have a letter, maybe from an academic institution or a ministry, some kind of tick box on that to make sure that you are covered. That's something I've done before I went. But you really have to also kind of get a letter from your own institution. Those two letters really helped. I know I thought at that time, I thought it was kind of formality and just in case, but it helped me a lot on where I had the complication. In Congo, things can be unpredictable. I remember when I had a visa, but arriving, there was so much question, especially with the Rwandan border, where they're saying, look, if you are coming from overseas, you cannot cross in the DRC using the main border. You have to be via flight. So they were wanting to send me back to Kigali, and then I can take a flight to Congo, to Kinshasa, then Kinshasa back to East. It was going to be too complicated. So I had to really beg them, say, look, I'm a student. And then they had to phone around, and when I came out, I came with a letter from my supervisor. It was like magic letter. Say, oh yes, okay, this one at least it would cover us to let you cross. But those are things really, unpredictable. I didn't know that I cannot use the main border by car. And I don't think this is something can affect many people anyway. Data protection, this was really an interesting cultural issue. In Congo, if you kind of start saying that you're going to record or you use so much forms in terms of data protection, that itself put people off. You really have to make it as informal as possible. Maybe at the end, you ask them, you say, look, this is something that as part of my university, they won't see as a trap. They can say no. I end up having to change my form to kind of really do the consent by a ticking box rather than a signature. That itself put them a little bit, reassure them. But as soon as you start making papers or you start talking about, making the interview very formal, people really start. They will give you things which they were not wanting to say, maybe general stuff. They don't want to make so much comments. I think that's not something that's inexperienced can be to everyone, but some cultural issue there. Languages were not an issue for me because I originally come from there. I interviewed people in probably 4 languages, which is interesting itself. The way people express in different languages is really interesting. When they talk in French, they become very, very formal. And when you speak to them in Swahili, they are quite more relaxed. They make a joke. They put an emotion to the content. French is an administrative language, and it can be. So I had to keep guessing, and kind of guessing which one I can use to interact with people. There was a place in Bukavu, South Kivu, where I originally come from. So I had gone to North Kivu, in Goma, to Kinshasa, in capital city, where I was doing archiving, and in Bukavu, which is the main city of the region where I come from. I really found that researching there very, very difficult. It was, I'm researching a conflict that's still active. It's not kind of where you're asking them about the past. Some of the interviews can be emotionally draining, where they're actually telling you about things happening now. There was a guy I interviewed, and during the interview he was speaking to kidnappers, negotiating for the hostage to be released. There's a bishop I spoke to in North Kivu. During the interview, he told me to stop the interview. There was a call from the president. Just really make things so live when you're speaking to those people who are engaged in everyday situation. And for you as a researcher, there's something that affects you, especially when you know the area. To finish, really, there's a question that Luke asked. What are signs that you kind of starting saying, look, my field work is ending? For me, it was really when I started realizing I'm not learning anything new. It's kind of getting saturation. This is really interesting. The type of research I'm doing is really interesting. That people will come up, academics who are also religious leaders or ordinary religious leaders who may not necessarily have education background. It's really interesting that the kind of response were similar, and that's really interesting for me, and it's really encouraging. And that was a sign to say, look, I need to wrap up. Decision really, in terms of knowing that you are ending, it's when you start to step back. You start kind of engaging with your data. You are really, if I was more organized like a Belen, I could have done so much of transcription during, and then you may be able to kind of see things you could ask in next interviews. Things that's really being said that you have not been able to ask again. That is the missed opportunity while you are there. Is really important to kind of verify. A challenge really now, I'm realizing that to have so much data, data analysis, you had to make a choice. Doing ethnography, and I initially thought I'm going to be using ground theory, but I'm finding the method being so narrow in terms of doing justice to the data. Now I've kind of considered it to do thematic analysis, similar to what Belen is doing. I've been kind of working, really putting question in kind of boxes and looking at responses and where I can put those responses in different boxes. And that for me is kind of a starting point. When I finished my transcriptions, what I did was, maybe this is something doesn't have to it's just for me really. My notes, of course, the notes you're doing when you conduct interview, you know that you're recording, you wanted to listen as much as possible. And you write very, very short summary notes. What I've done is looking at those notes, looking at the recording, and having almost something marrying both. And then the thematic analysis is almost kind of like a third stage of filtering. And I've just written kind of like a 10,000 words. I'm hoping to send it to supervisors. I'm sure they will send comments, and probably that will be kind of another filter kind of stage. That's what I can share with you. I think what I'm looking now is kind of how do I frame this data within the literature context. When you do field research, it's almost like I don't know whether I could call it top down or bottom up. You would have done so much literature. I've written a literature chapter, but I'm realizing now is going to be changing. So the findings will actually dictate the kind of literature you need to have at the end. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation there, Alex. Yes, so I'm a bit conscious of time. So could we have about we'll just reserve around about 2 minutes for questions, reflections for Alex? Faye's asked how long were you on fieldwork for, Alex?
Good question. 3 months, early April to end July. Yeah, almost 4 months, 3.5.
Yeah. Is there any other questions for Alex?
I mean, I have many questions, but that's just like, yeah, it's just it was so interesting to hear about the research and also that, like you said, you know, because you're saying 3 months, you had 3 months, but after the end of those 3 months, you felt like you had, it felt like enough time, because I guess it's different than like what people were saying before about it in anthropology anyway, the discipline, everyone gets quite protective over saying, oh, you need to have this really long fieldwork time.
Yes.
You know, you have to be there for a whole year, otherwise nothing will happen. So I don't know, it was very interesting that you said the 3 months was like enough time to get something for you that was like, yeah, I know where I'm at. Was that like, but could you stay longer, or did you need to come back at that time? Did it coincide well?
I really think that the advantage for me, you know, doing ethnography, you really have to have some certain times to get to know the place, the cultural barrier, language barrier, familiarity with, you know, contact between those network of people who may be able to introduce you to others. I guess for me that almost kind of something I had, especially this kind of people I was interviewing. You really have to have someone to introduce you to them. In Congo is kind of based on trust. So going back to your question, yes, I really was struggling with that expectation that in tradition anthropology you have to spend 1 year. I really at this moment I'm thinking if I'm going to go back, I'm kind of realizing that I have not spoken to people, ordinary people. In Bukavu, I went on the street and speaking to people, really looking at a statute of a bishop who was assassinated, who used to be quite vocal about conflict and peace. I wanted to know what people think of him, because he's seen as a martyr. But the statute itself is provocative. It has an image of people who've killed him. It doesn't, you know, it's itself kind of a symbol of resistance. I wish I would have done more of speaking to ordinary people. If I have to go back, 2 weeks would be enough. And I really kind of I agree with you. There is this expectation that in ethnography should have to be at least a year or 9 months, or it's amazing if you have to do that. But what I'm seeing, you could, if you're doing intensively, it is possible. I was trying to be greedy, knowing how difficult it was to go, and I kind of said, you know, if I'm here, let me do it as much as I can. And I sometimes interviewed like 5 people per day, or night, or Sunday, or Saturdays, or evenings. So anyway, long answer.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Maybe we can pick up on some of that again after the final presentation. Just quickly before we bring in James, I just think it's important for those who are at the pre-fieldwork stage to kind of take note of Alex's experience of moving away from grounded theory to thematic analysis and revising literature as well. So I think it's just a good analogy for how fieldwork is messy, it's not linear, it's unpredictable. So that's just a kind of like, I guess, a bit of a weight off of our shoulders to try and finish things in a certain order. Yeah, so James, if you're ready, we'll bring you in.
Yeah, hiya. I have got some slides to share, I think. That would work. Hopefully you can see those. So yeah, great. the chance to come today. Any excuse to avoid my thesis, so that's always nice. So I'm just going to talk a bit about fieldwork. So I'll just give you an idea of what I did, and then some of the issues that came up for me. So I'm actually in sociology / gender studies in Sussex, and I'm looking at something called domestic homicide review. So a statutory review mechanism that examines domestic abuse related deaths. And I'm just really interested in basically how they work to make sense of what happened, and in particular how they constitute the victim of that homicide in terms of as a subject, and what that happens then in terms of knowledge generation. So I guess what's relevant to know in terms of the work I was doing, I was looking at some published reviews and doing some analysis on those, doing a web-based survey, and then from that also going into semi-structured interviews, many of which I assumed would have been face-to-face, and as a consequence of COVID have all been online, for example. So these were the kind of issues I had, and it was a bit weird actually, because I was always going to be staying in the UK, but perhaps traveling around a bit for interviews, and the consequence of COVID-19 has basically meant I did everything from my front room, and it also happened to kind of kick in just as I was trying to get stuff out, so it was really difficult. So the survey was interesting in that because I've worked in the domestic abuse sector for about 15 years, I had lots of connections. So getting information out wasn't really ever going to be a problem, except all the normal communication channels kind of collapsed quite quickly, or they just got overwhelmed. So for example, I was going to get something sent out to police forces through a contact I had, who worked nationally with the police, and they came back and said, we just can't send it out because we're sending so much other stuff out related to COVID, it's just not appropriate anymore. So it made it really difficult to disseminate the survey in a sense. So I think it kind of affected some of the take up perhaps, and meant I had to think of some other channels, and also had to extend the duration that the survey was open. And the same kind of thing happened with the interviews. So the interviews were curious. So some people just weren't available for interviews. So they'd agreed to interviews, or perhaps I couldn't get them, or it took a really long time to book in an interview. But then there was also some positives of that. For some people, they were quite happy to have an interview because they were also working from home, and it was simply easier for them to schedule something in. And frankly, I think they wanted to talk to anyone who wasn't their immediate colleagues in endless team meetings and their family. So that was kind of a curious kind of mix. But the third area was actually and in a way the one which was most difficult, because the other two were really kind of technical issues in a way, was actually the in-depth reading. So when I was going to be reading these domestic homicide reviews, of which I had about 50, and I was going to do some broad data extraction on about 55 of them and do a close reading of a small sample. And just as lockdown happened, I went on a slightly ridiculous rescue attempt to university on abandoned roads to go and retrieve all my published printed domestic homicide reviews, because I thought I should get them and bring them home before I wasn't able to get onto campus for like however long. Oddly though, having got them home, I had absolutely no desire to look at them. And I think that was because I was obviously, like everyone else, stuck in a room. I lived on my own, so I had space, but it was my living area. And I had no desire to spend the day after day reading accounts of domestic homicide, basically. So they were rescued, but then promptly put in a corner and not looked at for some time. And I guess that's made me really think about emotional labor and research, which I'll kind of talk about a bit. So I'm going to talk about three things broadly. So one, the kind of desire to just need to stop collecting and get organized. Part of my problem, because the timeline was so prolonged around the data collection, because I just had to keep extending the deadlines, it was just really hard to draw a definite line for when I'd stopped collecting data. And I was just tempted to collect ever more, and now I'm drowning in data. But I guess I would really encourage people to think about that, and also like how you're going to justify your decision. So I personally do not like things like the ideas of saturation, and there's a good discussion about that by Braun and Clark, but kind of being clear when and how you're stopping and what's your rationalization for that seems really important. And actually, I made a kind of specific decision with the interviews that I would interview everyone who wanted to be interviewed, because I decided that if they'd made the effort to do the survey, which I then recruited them off the back of, and they had also expressed a wish to be interviewed during a lockdown, the very least I could do is interview them. So, you know, that was my kind of rationale, and I'd never anticipated making that kind of decision when I started. I guess it's interesting to hear people talk about transcription. I hate transcription with a passion, although I suppose it is interesting and helpful as well. But I think it's really worth having a plan around that. And I kind of accidentally set myself up for a fall, and then it was actually really helpful because I committed to interviewee transcript review. So I basically said in my ethics application, I would let all my interviewees see their interview if they wished, amongst various other things. So choosing their pseudonym, choosing how their role was described, that kind of stuff. And I didn't really know anything about it when I promised that, and then suddenly realized I should work out what it was, which has been a really interesting thing, and in my case really helped because it was sensitive data. We were often talking about specific cases. But having promised interview transcript review, it's not really okay to spend 6 months doing your transcription. So I ended up trying to return my transcriptions within 2 weeks of every interview, which was a bit intense at various points, particularly when I had kind of interviews concertinaing a bit. But I think for most of them, I managed to get them back within 2 weeks, and I don't think anything else was more than a month. So that meant I actually got a really good rate of return from participants as well. But it kind of, I guess my takeaway would be, have a think about your transcription, and it might be you can set stuff up in a way that just kind of motivates you to kind of get through it. What I had wished I'd been more systematic about, and that's interesting hearing about that e-tool, was me capturing my reflections. I wasn't particularly systematic about that. You know, I've got various books and notebooks I've started and piles of paper and all sorts of things all over the place, but I do wish I'd kind of gathered that in one place rather than just various scrawls. But yeah, stop collecting and get organized, or get a bit organized anyway. I guess the whole thing about making sense of data is really interesting. So for me, I was absolutely rubbish at analysis before I got back onto campus. I think I really struggled to do anything big, partly just because of the layout, and just partly because I just couldn't focus. So it was great being back on campus, and I think you just need to give yourself a break in terms of some of that kind of context of the work you're in, perhaps. What was great about that, though, is once I was able to get into the analysis, I could really analyze my perspective, what I was doing, and also how I was interpreting stuff. So that whole conversation around, say, grounded theory and thematic, the stuff I said I'd do, and then the stuff as I started doing it that either fitted or perhaps didn't. So it was really great to kind of go back and just refresh all that and be clear what I wanted to do. And I guess just a kind of sense of practice makes perfect, or at least a little bit better. And I really like this quote from Bron and Clark, who've just actually released a quite good, helpful book on thematic analysis, and they just talk about finding, losing, and finding your way again, which kind of really summarizes my experience of data analysis. I guess my big caution is I keep distracting myself with very interesting side projects, but they remain side projects, which definitely aren't my PhD. And perhaps that's just one of the things I need to work on. But kind of having some timelines and kind of sticking to them perhaps is useful too. And then the last thing I want to talk about is emotional labor. So I'm really interested in emotional labor generally, which, you know, there's lots of discussions about what it is, but basically for the purposes of research, it's this idea that you're doing stuff which is potentially impactful, and you're having to do work with that and think things through. So I was actually originally interested in my participants' experience of emotional labor in doing things like domestic homicide review. So what was it like to be in that kind of spaces? What kind of professional face did they have to put on, for example? But actually, what I came to realize was I was doing quite a lot of emotional labor too. And that was particularly when I realized I just couldn't bear the thought of reading these published DHRs when I was stuck in my room at home. And I guess it's really relevant to things like sensitive research in particular. So anything which could have an impact in terms of secondary trauma. But I think there's a broader point about kind of emotional impact of being a PhD researcher too. And I guess what's really interesting is basically, I think a lot of funders and researchers, funders and universities are a bit rubbish when it comes to this. So I have access to clinical supervision, but that's not funded. That's funded through my practice experience. So, and that generally seems to be what other people I've spoken to who have some kind of clinical supervision will say, that they get it because they're still a practitioner in some way. So I guess there's an interesting reflection there, perhaps, about how we might approach emotional labour generally as a university sector. But what I would encourage people to think about is, even if they don't have clinical supervision, to think about the kind of coping strategies and tools they could use. So whether that's kind of debriefs, journaling, some kind of supervision. And of course, your supervisors are really helpful, hopefully, but they're also not clinical supervisors. It's a different practice, basically. So if you can't get that, finding ways to get close to it or do some work. And Rega there, who I've cited, has actually a really good article on where she talks about a lot of her different strategies around emotional labour, which I'd really recommend if people are interested in it. Yeah, so I guess I often talk about emotional labour these days because I think it's a really interesting issue, but one we often don't really attend to a huge amount. And that is it. There's some references there if anyone wants them, and there you go.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation there, James. Again, lots of really useful and interesting things to think through. And I know on the back of our independent conversations, yeah, this whole thing about emotional labour is really, really important. Yeah, so we have a few minutes for reflections or any questions for James, if anyone would like to unmute themselves or drop a question into the chat. Oh yes, Faye.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was anything, now that you've kind of reflected, that you wish you'd done whilst doing your fieldwork and collecting your data that you maybe perhaps kind of overlooked at the time.
I think it was definitely the kind of rigor of kind of taking note, that kind of journaling and that reflective stuff as I went. So but I didn't do that in a systematic way. As I said, I just kind of wrote stuff all over the place. But you know, I wish I'd thought of using something like a single app where I could just collect that all in one place. So I think that was the big change for me, maybe. And then I think on a very practical level, and then I think I wonder if I would have set out, I would have designed my research slightly differently, I think, if I'd, but that's a hindsight thing, right? So I think I set myself up to have vastly too much data, which actually I probably could have, I'd probably always end up with a lot, but I could have kind of contained that slightly more. But again, I don't know if I or my supervisors would have known that going in. Whether I could have done that differently is another question. I don't know if that's an answer.
Yeah, thank you. Everything's great in hindsight.
Yeah.
We also have a question from Belen.
Hey, well, it's not so, I don't think it's a question, but more like a reflection. It was very interesting. Well, obviously, everything about transcriptions, when I was doing my slides, I was like, oh my God, transcriptions are the worst. So yeah, I totally agree. But I found very interesting how we have very different experiences of finishing fieldwork when you have to close it. And I'm sure there are different reasons, but I think one of them is also the difference between overseas and more local fieldwork and the flexibility that it gives you. In my case, I don't know what I could have done different, but I kind of regret that I made the decision so early, because then I couldn't change it, you know, and I left with this sense of, am I gonna miss something important? And in your case, you are the opposite. You're like, no, you need to set up the boundaries. So it's more a reflection. I just thought, you know, it's a very interesting two sides I found. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really true, isn't it? And definitely something to do with the ease of access for me, right? Yeah,
Mm.
the conditions I was working in just allowed, yeah, it just set it up differently, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Thank you. Very interesting talk. Thanks.
Would anybody else like to share anything with us and with James? I guess I'll step in then. Yeah, it's a question about this emotional labor thing as well. It's very, very important, and I think I'm thinking about it in terms of the other side of the field work, you know, the beginning stages of field work. But when you mentioned, and I of course know this, that you were doing basically your research from your front room in your apartment, and you were living on your own, which of course creates a whole different conversation about the emotional labor that's required of you. I was just wondering, like, how are you dealing with the space that you were in? Like, as you were coming out of fieldwork, you were no longer doing any interviews. It was more about trying to reflect on what you've done and make sense of the data that you've captured. Are there any kind of tips or anything that you did that you found particularly useful for kind of trying to reclaim your space back home, to kind of do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, oddly, on a very practical level, I rearranged my front room. So my sofa, I mean, I won't take you around a guided tour, and this is not open houses, but I ended up moving my room around a bit, so it kind of creates, it's not a huge front room, but it meant I could have a kind of living room bit, and then my dining room bit, which was where I was working mostly. But I'd kind of moved a sofa, so it's kind of in the middle of the room, so it felt like I had a kind of separate section almost. So there was a very practical step that I did to that. But also, as I said, I just didn't read the domestic homicide reviews at home. So I started and I did some of the broad data extraction work, but then kind of had a conversation with my supervisors, and were like, I just don't want to spend days on end on my own, particularly at the start of lockdown when you could only go out for whatever it was, an hour, reading about these homicides with no alternative space. You know, I just don't think that sounds like a good way to spend my time. And that's a real privilege though, right? So there was lots of frontline practitioners who didn't have that benefit. So I then did other things instead. But you know, so in a way I was very lucky that my supervisors were up for that conversation and kind of supportive of that as well.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, James. Yeah, sorry, we've kind of run over a bit of time, but if it's okay, we will move over to Rich now.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, mine's probably anyway a little bit shorter. Okay. The main difference probably between mine and everyone else's is that, like, I finished my field work exactly when COVID started. So my fieldwork was in India, in Delhi, and I was working with education NGOs, and I was volunteering with one NGO that worked in partnership with a government school. And the school year in Delhi runs from kind of April till April. So I arrived in fieldwork 3 months before starting to do language training. Like what you were talking about, Alex, you know, I had been in India a bit before for my master's research and a few other times, and my Hindi was like very beginner, but it was starting out. But I took then 3 months to do more of trying to intense learning, which often just involved watching cartoons in Hindi to try to like get myself out of bed in the morning. I was like, this is work, this counts as work because I'm reading. Anyway, so any tactics to try and learn. But anyway, the point is that I started volunteering at a school as a teacher in basically April 2019, and then did the school year around till February, and March was going to be the last term, which is anyway half of it's a holiday, and there's so a couple of weeks. So basically, the school closed on March 1st, and my last day in the school was meant to be around March 15th. So I kind of lost 2 weeks of fieldwork, which so didn't affect my data collection, but it did affect a lot to do with like my transition out of the field, because I wanted to leave for about 6 weeks and then come back, because I wanted to end my fieldwork and then take a break and then come back to India to say goodbye to people in a kind of more like informal way, because I'd been working so close with all these different people that I felt it was really, I was like, okay, I've got the time, I think, to take some space off, then come back, have those more personal, kind of like in this world of emotional labor stuff, like have these kind of more direct, intimate conversations with people, telling them a bit more about that now I'm going to be transitioning out of my role as a kind of educator, researcher, into just being like finishing my PhD as a researcher at university, writing a big thesis, which I think, again, that transition is still affecting me because I haven't been able to go back to India since then, which again, with COVID, is no surprise, but I'll tell you, my methods are quite biographical, quite intimate, quite psychological, anthropological methods. So I do quite a lot of trying to kind of reveal quite a lot about, I guess, my participants' emotional worlds and like where they're at as individuals in their maybe romantic relationships, or in their relationships with their families, or being mothers, or being members of a community where they feel they're being judged quite carefully on their contribution to this movement of education development. And the way I've written my thesis involves like quite a lot of exposition, I guess, around some of their more things they might not expect of me to put in, because they don't, because hearing about that it's research, they were less familiar maybe with ethnographic research as a narrative ethnography as a kind of form of presenting data. So I think that is, and I'm almost at the end of my writing up, and I've written basically everything, but I'm still, I've had conversations. I've been struggling with how to share. James was mentioning this kind of idea of sharing transcripts and then getting people to choose their own pseudonyms or whatever, and getting them to kind of have their own space of, oh, I'm not sure about this or that. I'm not exactly sure how it works for you, James, but I've tried to share, I've shared certain parts of my thesis with at least the few of the people in it. And I think it's been difficult for them, especially one person, because again, I think I've shifted out of a role of being a kind of a friend and kind of colleague, because I was working with the same NGO he was running, to being a kind of, he knew this was always part of our conversations, was a kind of debate and a critique, but now I've kind of taken this space away and written him into a world where he doesn't have the power to write back, or maybe doesn't have the relationship with the disciplines of the language and the kind of theory is alien to him. So it's a really complicated process, I think, that exchange. So yeah, just a small comment on fieldwork, I'm not going to do a tour, but I will just show you one small, my favorite thing about my fieldwork, which was making my colored notebooks, which are now sitting on top of this wardrobe here. So that was one way that I basically used, I had like 12 different notebooks, one for each month, going from red all the way around the rainbow. And in a weird way, it was just kind of like, I felt that was quite therapeutic almost, like in terms of like a structure where I could kind of say, okay, I'm getting through. And I actually made this small bookcase in my house in Delhi during fieldwork, so I could like show, like, so I could literally like see them. So I could be like, wow, look how far I've gone. I've done like 6 months now, or like I've done 7 months or whatever. And it was a kind of like effective visual thing. Yeah, I was also teaching kind of drama and theatre as a teacher in India. So that's kind of also maybe part of just who I am. I just like to like make stories and visualize things. Anyway, when I came back, yeah, it was mid-COVID, I came back to the UK. Luckily, I could stay with my parents for a few months while I sorted out all the stuff you were talking about, Belen, which is obviously really difficult, how to come back and where to be. So I was lucky enough to be able to stay with them, and that was relatively pretty peaceful and easy enough. So, and then I moved back to London, where I was kind of been living on and off, I guess, for about 10 years. So yeah, but in terms of the kind of process of the writing up, I guess my biggest sharing is kind of this two-stage process where people have been talking about thematic analysis or different forms of analysis. I guess for me, I kind of wrote the thesis twice, but like it was a necessary project because I wrote effectively 4 long chapters with all the data that I wanted to get in. And it took me about 6 months, and I just wrote and sent chapters to my supervisors, and it was very messy and just lots of ethnographic data, just lots of the stories that I thought were important, vaguely in these themes that were important to me, like self-reflection was a theme, family, leadership, which are still themes that are very much relevant in my thesis, but my thesis isn't organized now around those themes in quite the same way. So I wrote those, like kind of all the material that I knew would have hopefully, at least some of that would go in to the final bit. And then after that, I kind of sat back and said, right, what do I actually care? What am I actually going to do? Because there's like 10 different theses in here and I can't write them all. So I have to actually just narrow it down. So I just chucked out loads and loads of stuff. I mean, I haven't chucked it out, it's somewhere, but I basically went down to like 10% of the material that I'd written. One of the chapters was 45,000 words long. So when my supervisors got that, they were like, please, not again. No thanks. So I was, yeah, that was quite fun. That was last summer, like summer before just one gone. And, you know, they asked me to write lots of stuff. So I did what I was told. Anyway, so yeah. And then basically from kind of last Christmas, this time January last year, I was like, right, I need to work out what this is saying. 45,000, yes, you did hear that rightly. Anyway, basically what I was going to say was, yeah, so then I like spent 3 months, I guess, from January to March, just start like writing a kind of original overview intro chapter that was like, this is what I think I want to do. And like, that's effectively where I kind of distilled a couple of key concepts that I'd kind of, I guess, in kind of coined or whatever as a way of dealing with like some of the ways that I think people in this community are oriented, the values they're oriented around, because my thesis is quite a lot about values and how people understand what they're trying to teach and what they value as like a good person and as a citizen in India, or as a kind of ethical being, or this kind of stuff. So then the last 5 months, 6 months, well, yeah, 7 months, I've rewritten the chapters, but all the material, the ethnographic material was written. So it wasn't like the material was there. I basically just collaged, cut and pasted, moved things around, and then just like wove it together. And I actually ended up doing what I also did in my master's thesis, which I wasn't intending, which is making kind of each chapter really mainly on one person. Well, it's not quite true. I've got 4 ethnographic chapters, and the first one's much more broad, like showing what this bigger NGO does and how it works. And then the second chapter's got like 2 main protagonists, and then the third has got 1, and the fourth has got 1. So basically the third chapter is just about one person, and so is the 4th chapter. And I didn't originally want to do it this way, but it's just worked out. And I don't know, kind of ironic, because I wanted to try and have a more relational kind of approach, understanding, like moving away from kind of individuation and individuals, and whereas I almost wanted to do things like composite characters. But I kind of, in the end, the way it just happened was I couldn't think it any other way. Like the way I could think it was, this person is a whole person, and I want to show them I want to show as full a version of them as I can, because what I was saying a lot of the time was quite, if you only got a snapshot, I think you could see them as shallow and a bit of a villain in some ways. And I really didn't want anyone to come away thinking, well, this person isn't a nuanced, emotional person who's struggling with what they're doing in the world. Because I feel like I critique a lot of the education theory that some of the people use, but I'm trying to show how it comes to be in their lives, rather than like they're arrogant or they're selfish or they're just ambitious, or they just want to kind of, they're proud, which it's taken me a long time, and I still haven't achieved, to try to write it in that kind of open way, so that you cannot judge these people, even though I want to show why I have my disagreements with some of their development mission. Anyway, what else was I going to say? Yeah, I guess that was a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of probably enough. That's the main thing I kind of wanted to say, I guess, because I'm just at the end of that process of doing these two parts of the writing, and I kind of feel like it worked, but it was a lot of writing. And I'm someone also, just to point out, that I'm someone who like writes very quickly and messily. So it's not like when I say 45 the words, I mean, this is like there was no references in there or anything. There was no like, oh, it was just stories kind of thing. So it just comes out, and then later on I like really kind of edit it down. Anyway, that's fine. I can end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Rich, as well. Very insightful, and I really like that idea of the rainbow coloured themed notebooks as well. I want to ask you more questions about that as well. But in the meantime, does anyone have any reflections or questions for Rich, or indeed actually for any of the presenters as well? Come on, I'm sure you do. Yeah, okay, so I have a thought or a question, depending on how this goes. And it's, yeah, partly about your different coloured notebooks and the way that you kind of experiment with trying to visualize the data. Could you explain a little bit more about that process? Are you trying to find different ways of seeing it? Because I think this is a kind of a question of like neurodiversity as well, because the way I have like 5 or 6 different ways of trying to write down field notes, and I'm still trying to find my way around that. But I think that's probably particularly quite useful for when we come out of fieldwork as well, these different ways of visualizing data and writing about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'll just jump in, because I think it's interesting you mentioned neurodiversity, because I guess it's a term that's become more popular now, and I guess I'm still questioning like how to relate to it and whether it's kind of self-identify or kind of, you know, diagnosed or whatever. But I think that like definitely in terms of diversities of spaces of learning and understanding, and like how, I mean, I had a Google document for every month of my fieldwork that kind of coincided with the notebook. So I would like writing notebooks for more like in the moment, like sometimes even drawings, but lots of just like writing what people have said, because I didn't record most of the kind of participant observation I did. I was just sitting in school, people start chatting, I'd write down a few things they said.
Yeah.
And then if I was in an NGO meeting, I'd just sit there as well and note things down. I didn't want to like record and didn't need to break that space. And then with separate interviews, I did record, and transcriptions I did do, but anyway, that's a different story. But yeah, and I think, so I feel like I had like, yeah, having a physical notebook where there were things that I could be more textured, like kind of drawings that would remind me of a space, was helpful. And then a more like written thing online, like on a kind of desk, on a computer laptop, where I could be like, this is how it works. This is today. Like, so it would be like, you know, December 1st, 10 a.m., some thoughts. And normally I do that like on what happened the day before, or if I got home at night and I had the energy, I'd do it then. So yeah, I think having those two spaces was like helpful, because then when I've gone back, it's been really helpful, because you can search, you know, Control F and find words through that stuff. But
yeah,
in a handwritten note, but you can't do that. But I feel like I really cherished having the notebook with me, so that I was ready at any point just to note something down for myself. And then the thing that was a more of a developed thought was normally written out kind of on a word processor.
Yeah, awesome. Anybody want to jump in? Yes, Belen has raised her hand.
Yes. So Rich, I found very interesting, and I didn't think about that before, or maybe because, yeah, I didn't know exactly the impact that COVID had on you, and the fact that you couldn't finish fieldwork the way you had planned. And I find that that's very interesting. I never thought of that as a process. So yeah, I'm just wondering, I don't know, how do you feel about that now? Is the impact as you know, personally, or do you think it had an impact also on your research or on the way you have analyzed the stories, or the way you have, I don't know, in the process of the research somehow, or it's more personally, you couldn't say goodbye to the people, you know, the way you had planned it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is difficult. I think there's this the mantra, whatever the word is, like the mantra or axiom in anthropology is that, oh, you need to get distance from your field site so then you can write about it, you know, and without distance then, you know, you can't get like a clear analysis or something. And it's like it's almost connected to this question of emotional labor. It's like, it seems like the history of anthropology is basically removing yourself from emotional labor, like basically cutting off emotional connections to people so that you can like analyze objectively in some way. Yeah, like that's what the historical male anthropologist is meant to do, like, you know, kind of like capture a whole area by like systemizing it down rather than like having actual relationships with the people, you know. And you get these old textbooks that say things like only written for men, being like, keep off women in the field, and you're like, half the people in this course are women, you know, how are we reading these? Like, you know, I mean, I know they're old fashioned, but they're still there. And it's a really weird, like, I guess I've in a way had to accept, or like maybe I've indulged in like the forced distance of COVID in a way, because COVID's come, it's almost given me this excuse, like, well, I can't really go directly contact these people face to face, so, oh well, I'll just write my thesis, and if it turns out like a bit more objective-y, because like I've got to write a thesis that fits into the discipline of, like, you know, the university. I don't know, I'm still struggling with that, I guess. Like, I don't know how to deal with it, and I am like worried about going, because my partner's from India, and she's part of a similar network of people who I was researching, and a lot of these people are friends who I went to their wedding and stuff like that, and like, and they're people who I will want to see again, and not like it's, and I just don't know the people who are in the work, how, if we can build a bridge again, because I know that unless we sit down face to face, I don't think I can explain what I'm trying to do. Because it's people are very, like, I'm writing about people's like life purpose. Yeah, they're like, I'm dedicated my life to this like project, and I'm like, sure, but why? And you know, it's a confronting question, but I think those people also want to ask that question, but how to facilitate a conversation is very delicate. And so yes, I don't know, but I'm struggling with it.
Well, sorry, I asked just that question. But I thought it's very interesting. Yeah, maybe something you need to explore and maybe include.
Yeah.
This is or somewhere else. Yeah, because it's very interesting. Yeah.
Does anyone have any other final thoughts? In which case, I'm going to steal Faye's kind of question that she's asked in the previous sessions, where we'll ask each of the presenters if they were to just give one bit of advice for those who are either pre-field work or like myself at the early stages of field work. One bit of tip of advice when it comes to the end of field work, what's a good thing, what's a good practice to do to kind of mark the end of the data collection to data analysis phase, I guess. And just jump in whenever.
To celebrate or to mark the end, or
I like that one. That's very good.
I think, like, I mean, I don't know how you do this exactly, but like some kind of like relationship with acceptance, almost like, okay, that, I guess, it's helped me, like a trust that, like, at the end of the day, it's a PhD thesis. It's not like you've built a, you know, new medicine that if you haven't gotten it right, you're going to kill 1 billion people. Like almost like, okay, I'm here right now, like, and like almost maybe like gratitude for like, okay, I've had this time with these people. Is there a way of like saying, I know this isn't a very practical thing, but almost like saying enough? Because I guess in a way, the reason why I wanted to be able to go back was to have that, but I couldn't do that. So in a way, I had to just be like, this is what the world's given me. COVID has done it to us all, yeah? Like, this is what the world's given me, so here I am. And like Alex was saying a bit about, okay, it's 3 months, and then you get to a point, yeah, maybe you want a bit more time, but I don't know, here you are. Like, I don't know, almost giving up on the autonomy of it, almost on the agency of it somehow. Because I feel like Fieldwork's so much like, I'm going to do something every day, I'm going to do something every day. Just to be like, I'm not doing anything. I don't know, that's not very good.
No, that's great.
I think for me, a tip I can mention is really we tend to focus so much on research, and I know Belén has mentioned about logistics, and apart from research, we probably could a little bit more on logistics, but what we often forget is looking after ourselves. Well-being, I think, that's given so tiny, tiny time. We don't think about that, and how the research, the research would impact on us. I don't mean in kind of an extreme way, but really knowing that you need to have some time for yourself, reflect, well-being generally. There's so many things that are not necessarily put into the writing of the ethics application. Things that you may not necessarily, you get in contact with people. How do you constantly keep reminding yourself about your general well-being? I think that's something is often forgotten.
Yeah,
I think actually the first thing that came to my mind, but I was too shy to say it, but the first thing that came to my mind was going on holidays. That's the first thing I thought. And so to me, even that I was in Spain during my field work, because of the COVID restrictions, I couldn't really, so my family is in Spain, but in a different city. So I couldn't really travel. I couldn't see them despite being in the same country for the whole year. So what I did, and I think it was a good thing. So before coming back, I went there, I saw them, I spent like a couple of weeks with them. And I think it's part of the well-being and the taking care of ourselves, which we usually forget. Yeah. But I think also, at least for me, it was good to have like a breakup, like some time in between, not jumping from fieldwork to writing. I think I really needed this something else in between to help moving from one stage to the other. So yeah, maybe, have a break, do something that you like, maybe visiting friends or doing something.
Yes.
To change a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think I'd say the same thing, and it's all about getting some perspective, right? I think part of the point of gathering your data is you're immersed in, whatever you're doing, you're immersed in it, right? And by its very nature, that means you no longer have perspective because you've just spent X months doing that thing. So I think, it feels like the common thing a lot of people are saying is finding a way to step out of that space, even for a while, and just kind of reorientate. It seems really, it seems essential, just practically and in terms of your own well-being. Yeah, I think. And also for your friends, because they probably really don't want to hear about your data again for a while. They need time too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. And thank you for attending, and a special thanks to the presenters as well.